Trump thought a jab at her marriage would rattle Jasmine Crockett instead. 47 seconds later, it became the moment she dismantled his credibility in front of a live national audience. The air inside the Phoenix Convention Center was thick with the kind of tension you could almost taste. 100 feet of bright stage lights poured down on two podiums, separated by a modest table stacked with water bottles and scattered note cards. The American flag hung in the background, its edges rippling slightly in the artificial breeze from the stage fans. Every seat in the hall was filled: business suits beside denim jackets, MAGA caps beside Vote for Change, buttons, cable news cameras lined the back wall, their red tally lights blinking like silent warning signals. It wasn't just another political event. This was a live primetime town hall with President Donald Trump and Representative Jasmine Crockett, broadcast across multiple networks. No scripts, no pre-recorded safety nets. Every word was live, every gesture immortalized in real time. Jasmine Crockett had walked into the building knowing the stakes. Her team had warned her. Trump's style was unpredictable, and the man had a knack for taking conversations into territory that had nothing to do with policy. But she wasn't here to trade barbs for entertainment. She was here to talk about jobs, education, and healthcare in communities often overlooked. From her spot backstage minutes before showtime, Crockett had peeked out at the audience. She saw older veterans adjusting their baseball caps, young families holding kids on their laps, and a row of college students whispering excitedly while clutching phones in their hands. But what struck her most was the energy, tense, like people knew something unscripted was bound to happen. She'd chosen a sharp navy blue blazer over a cream blouse, simple gold earrings, and her hair pulled neatly back. Not because she wanted to impress him, but because she wanted the cameras to see someone in command of herself, ready for whatever was coming. The moderator and even voice journalist named Brian Talbot stepped forward to introduce them. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the President of the United States, Donald J. Trump, and Representative Jasmine Crockett. The applause was uneven. Some clapped enthusiastically. Others reluctantly. Cameras caught Trump strolling in with his trademark grin, shaking hands with a few front row attendees before taking his podium. Crockett followed, offering a polite nod to the audience as she stepped to hers. The first few minutes moved predictably. Questions about border security, debates on the economy. Crockett was ready for those. She had statistics on unemployment rates, examples of small businesses bouncing back in overlooked cities, and pointed observations about infrastructure gaps. Trump countered with broad claims of economic strength and personal credit for recent job growth. But there was something in the way he looked at her after each answer. A pause, a quick scan of her face. The dumb hint of a smirk. Crockett felt it, but kept her posture upright, shoulders squared. In the third segment, the moderator shifted to healthcare. Representative Crockett, you've been vocal about reforming access to rural hospitals. Can you elaborate on how your plan would work in areas with low population density? She began explaining the strategy: state partnerships, funding, expansions, mobile clinics. When she noticed Trump shifting at his podium, resting both elbows on it like a man preparing to interject. Still, she kept her rhythm. She wasn't about to let him pull her off track. The crowd was listening, nodding at her points. A woman in the second row mouthed something to her teenage son, gesturing toward the stage. Crockett caught it in her peripheral vision and smiled briefly before returning to her point. Trump stayed silent, but his eyes stayed fixed on her. She'd seen that look before in committee hearings. It was the prelude to something designed to throw her off balance from the back of the room. Cameraman shifted his tripod, and Crockett caught the red tally light swinging toward her again. This was the angle they'd cut to for her reaction. She made a mental note to keep her expression steady. No matter what, Brian Talbot wrapped up her time and pivoted to the president. Mr. President, do you have a response to Representative Crockett's proposal? Trump leaned toward his microphone. Well, I think it's a lot of talk. She likes to talk a lot. Maybe she should focus more on keeping her own household in order before telling the country how to run its hospitals. It wasn't the line yet, but it was close enough to make a few people in the crowd murmur. Crockett inhaled slowly and fixed her eyes on the moderator instead of him. The energy in the room tightened. Talbot tried to bring the conversation back to policy, but it was clear both of them were circling something Crockett could feel. The moment building. The audience didn't know it yet, but they were minutes away from seeing one of the most replayed political exchanges of the year one that would shift more than just the conversation in that hall. But Trump was about to cross a line. He didn't realize she'd been waiting for him to step over the applause from the introductions had barely faded before Brian Talbot launched into the first segment. He was skilled at keeping things moving, short questions. No drawn-out speeches. But tonight there was an edge to his tone, almost like he sensed these two were sitting on more than just policy disagreements. Representative Crockett, he began, "You've been vocal about accountability in federal spending. Can you give us a concrete example of where the current administration has failed in this area?" Jasmine Crockett didn't hesitate, absolutely. "We've got millions going to programs that have no measurable results, while hospitals in rural America are closing and school districts are cutting staff. That's not just waste, it's negligence, and it's hurting everyday people." Her voice was calm but direct. Every sentence landed like a stone skipping across still water. She didn't look at Trump yet. She wanted the words to settle in first. Trump adjusted his microphone. "Look, I think the Congresswoman is confused. We've done an incredible job, probably the best job at managing this country's finances. We've got record growth, record jobs, the best numbers you've ever seen." Crockett's lips twitched into something halfway between a smile and a smirk. "Mr. President, if those numbers were helping everyday Americans, they wouldn't be choosing between buying medicine and paying their electricity bills. Growth on paper doesn't keep the lights on in someone's home." That got a few scattered claps from the audience. Trump glanced at them, then back at her, tilting his head slightly as if sizing her up. Brian moved them into foreign policy. Trump went first this time, painting broad strokes about strength deals and getting America respect again. Crockett listened without interrupting, though her pen tapped lightly against her notepad. When it was her turn, she didn't start with a counterpoint. She started with a story. "Last month, I met a young veteran in Yuma, Arizona. He'd served 2 tours overseas and came home with injuries that will affect him for life. You know what he told me? He said he didn't feel respected, not because of what happened over there, but because of what happened when he came back. Our VA system failed him. If we're talking about respect, we should start with the people who already gave everything for this country." That drew a stronger wave of applause. Trump's face stayed neutral, but his eyes flicked toward the cameras. He didn't like losing the crowd's attention. The next question from Brian was about education. Crockett used it to bring up teacher shortages in rural areas, linking them to broader economic instability. Trump countered by saying teachers should perform better and that unions were making things worse. The back and forth was brisk, almost competitive in its pace. Crockett would answer. Trump would fire back and vice versa, but under the surface something was shifting. Trump's tone began leaning away from policy and closer to personality. The pauses before his responses were getting shorter, his interruptions a little sharper. When Brian asked a question about bipartisan cooperation, Trump leaned into his mic with a grin. "Well, I'm always willing to work with people, as long as they're not just trying to make themselves look good on TV, like some people here tonight." A few in the audience laughed. Crockett let it pass without reaction, but she made a mental note. This wasn't a debate for him anymore. It was a stage. Her next turn came with a question on healthcare, and that's when she saw the shift in his posture. He leaned back in his chair, one arm draped over the side, watching her like he was waiting for a moment to pounce. She kept her voice steady, explaining funding gaps, patient access, and the need for reforms. Then it happened, the first real break from the script. Trump interrupted. Mid-sentence, maybe if she spent less time giving speeches and more time at home, she'd understand real priorities. The crowd made a sound, part gasp, part nervous laughter. It wasn't the full hit yet, but it was a shot across the bow. Crockett paused just long enough to let the weight of it hang in the air, then finished her point without acknowledging the jab. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of a flustered reaction. Not yet. Brian quickly tried to shift gears, but anyone paying attention could see it. The two of them were moving closer to a collision. Every answer was a little sharper, every glance a little longer. Trump was building towards something, and Crockett could feel it. Not as a threat, but as an opening she could use if he took it too far. But before that moment came, she wanted to make sure the country knew she was here to talk policy, not play defense, because that contrast would matter when the line finally got crossed. Brian Talbot had just transitioned to a segment on rural healthcare policy, when the tension that had been simmering all night finally boiled over. The question itself was straightforward. "Mr. President, you've often criticized healthcare reform proposals from Democrats. How would you address the ongoing closures of small-town hospitals?" Trump answered in broad strokes. Funding cuts he blamed on past administrations, a promise to look into it, and a jab about bad management. Then, almost as if he couldn't resist, he swiveled toward Jasmine Crockett. "You know, maybe if she spent more time focusing on real issues instead of making a name for herself, her own marriage would be in better shape." For a moment, The hall didn't feel like a political event. It felt like someone had slammed the brakes in the middle of traffic. The audience's reaction wasn't a clean gasp, it was fragmented. A few people laughed, others muttered in disbelief. And somewhere in the back, a man shouted, "Come on!" Crockett didn't look away. She stood exactly where she was, hands resting lightly on the podium. Her eyes locked on him. The cameras caught it instantly, that unwavering stare. The kind that says, "I heard you and I'm deciding how to respond." The moderator looked visibly uncomfortable, shifting in his chair. "Let's try to stay on." But Trump wasn't done. "I'm just saying, if you're going to give advice to America, maybe make sure your own house is in order." First, it wasn't subtle, it wasn't coded, it was personal. Crockett inhaled through her nose, holding the air for just a moment, before letting it out slowly in her mind. A clock started ticking. She had two choices: fire back instantly, or take just long enough to make the audience lean forward. She went with the second, "Mr. President." She said, her voice low but clear enough for the microphones to catch every syllable. "The state of my marriage is none of your business, just like the personal lives of every American woman you've ever tried to put in her place." The room reacted in waves, applause from one section, murmurs from another. Trump smirked, leaning on the podium like he'd been waiting for her to snap. But she didn't give him that. She didn't raise her voice, she continued. "But since you've brought it up, maybe this is a good time to remind people that leadership isn't about tearing down families or mocking women for having lives outside their husbands. It's about serving the public with integrity." A woman in the third row clapped hard enough to be heard through the mic. Someone else shouted, "That's right." Trump tried to cut in, but Brian raised a hand toward him, sensing the crowd was shifting. "Let her finish." Mr. President Crockett straightened her notes, but didn't look down at them. "If you think my worth is defined by my marriage, then you've misunderstood every single person who sent me here to speak on their behalf. They didn't elect me to be anyone's wife. They elected me to fight for their jobs, their health care, and their future." The applause came faster now, rolling across the hall in bursts. Even some people who'd been sitting stiffly with folded arms earlier were nodding along. Trump adjusted his stance, looking less amused. "Well, that's Crockett," held up a hand palm out. "You had your turn, now it's mine." The room lit up with cheers, and in that moment, the entire dynamic shifted. This wasn't a back and forth anymore. She had taken control. Every camera was pointed at her, every microphone tuned to her tone. Trump leaned back slightly, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. He wasn't used to someone controlling the tempo once he'd gone personal. Crockett closed her statement by turning back to the original healthcare question. "Now, if we're done talking about my personal life, let's get back to why rural hospitals are shutting down while pharmaceutical companies post record profits, because that's the conversation the American people deserve." The applause came again, not polite but sustained. Brian glanced between them, clearly aware this moment would lead every news cycle for the next 48 hours, but Crockett wasn't done. So, as she was about to pivot from defending herself to dismantling his entire political narrative, piece by piece, the insult was out there now. No taking it back, no rephrasing, no hiding behind the excuse of a joke Trump had aimed for her marriage. And in doing so, he'd shifted the tone of the entire night. The cameras caught every flicker of Jasmine Crockett's expression in those first few seconds afterward. She didn't smile. She didn't scowl. She just let the silence hang like a weighted blanket over the room. People in the audience leaned forward, sensing something was coming, but not sure how hard she would hit back. She was thinking not just about the insult, but about the audience at home. Every living room, every phone screen, every break room TV playing this exchange tomorrow morning. She knew if she went too far, it could be spun as her losing control. If she went too soft, the clip would fade into political noise from his podium. Trump seemed confident she'd either stumble or overreact. He adjusted his microphone, ready to pounce on whatever came next. The faintest curl of a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, a smile that said he thought he'd won the moment. But Crockett wasn't interested in playing his game. She was about to change the rules. Her eyes scanned the crowd, not rushing, just taking them in the middle-aged man in a work shirt with grease stains still on the collar. The older woman clutching her purse like it held more than money. The college student in the back row live streaming on her phone. This wasn't just a debate stage anymore. This was her chance to speak directly to the country, using him as the example of everything she wanted to call out. In her head, she counted down 3, 2, 1. "Mr. President," she began, her voice steady but charged. "You just told millions of people watching tonight that a woman's credibility depends on her marriage. That's not leadership. That's an insult to every woman who has ever worked twice as hard to be taken half as seriously. Rumble went through the crowd, some clapping, some murmuring, but she didn't pause for long. You want to talk about houses being in order, she continued, her tone sharpening just a touch. Let's talk about the one you've been living in for the last 4 years. Let's talk about the promises made and the promises broken. Let's talk about the real priorities of the American people, the ones that don't fit neatly into a soundbite. Trump shifted his weight, gripping the edges of the podium with both hands. He didn't interrupt this time. Brian Talbot, the moderator, tried to step in, but Crockett kept going. She was moving deliberately now, building momentum in a way that felt conversational, but carried the rhythm of a closing argument. She lowered her voice slightly. I was raised by a father who told me never to let anyone define my worth for me. And tonight, I'm telling every young girl watching you, don't need permission from a man to be powerful. Not from your boss, not from your president, not from anyone. The applause swelled. Even the moderator glanced at her with something like respect. She wasn't just talking to him anymore. She was talking through him. Every sentence was both a rebuttal and a reminder that his jab had backfired. Trump adjusted his tie and muttered something into his mic, but it was lost under the sound of clapping. His smirk had faded, replaced with the kind of expression politicians wear when they realize they're no longer steering the conversation. Crockett leaned slightly forward, eyes fixed on the camera. And for the record, Mr. President, my marriage is strong. Not because it's perfect, but because it's built on respect, something this country could use a little more of from its leaders. The crowd was on its feet now. Some were clapping, others cheering in the chaos of noise. Trump's voice finally cut in, but it lacked the punch it had before. Okay, fine. You made your speech. She didn't give him a chance to finish. It's not a speech, sir. It's the truth. That line hit like a drumbeat. Short, final, unanswerable. Brian stepped in quickly to move the conversation forward. All right, let's bring it back to healthcare policy. Crockett smiled faintly and nodded. Letting him have the floor, she'd landed her first real strike. But she knew she had more to say and more to connect directly to his record. But before she went for the knockout, she wanted to tie his insult to a bigger story, one that would expose cracks in his entire presidency. The cameras might have been focused on the stage, but the shift in the room was impossible to miss after her last line. Crockett had not only steadied the ship, she'd turned it toward open waters, leaving Trump standing there with an insult that now hung in the air like a bad smell. Brian Talbot's voice cut through Representative Crockett. Let's get back to the matter of rural health care. But Crockett didn't move on just yet. She saw the audience leaning forward, waiting. You don't let go of a moment like that. You use it. Here's the thing, she said, gesturing toward the crowd. When you've got a president willing to make personal attacks instead of addressing policy, you have to ask yourself, is this about leadership or is it about ego? That landed heads nodded. Some in the front row murmured in agreement. She shifted her weight, settling into a tone that felt less like debating and more like talking to the people directly. Mr. President, you called my marriage into question tonight. You turned a conversation about saving hospitals into a conversation about my personal life. But I think Americans are tired of leaders who punch down instead of lifting people up. Trump leaned toward his mic. I'm just saying, if you want to fix something, you start at home. That's all. Crockett didn't flinch. And if you want to be president, you start with respect. That's all. The audience broke into applause again, longer this time. Cameras caught Trump glancing toward the crowd just for a second. But that second mattered. She kept going, her voice gaining rhythm. We've got communities in places like Elko, Nevada and Muncie, Indiana, losing their only hospital within 50 miles. We've got mothers driving 2 hours to give birth, seniors missing treatments because the nearest clinic shut down. And tonight, instead of addressing that, the president wanted to talk about my marriage. The contrast was so stark, you could feel it settling over the room. Trump tried to steer it back to numbers. We've got the best economy in the world, more jobs than ever. People are doing great under my administration. She didn't give him an inch. Tell that to the coal miner in Logan, West Virginia, who just got his third medical bill sent to collections, or the teacher in rural Kansas, who's working a second job just to afford insulin. You think they care about whether I'm married or whether I'm fighting to get them healthcare? Someone in the audience yelled, "Tell him," and the hall erupted into cheers again. Trump raised his eyebrows clearly. Not used to losing control of a crowd in real time, he opened his mouth, but Crockett was already there. You see, this is why people get cynical about politics. They think it's all theater. And when the president turns serious issues into personal jabs, it proves them right. But it doesn't have to be that way. We can focus on the real problems without tearing each other down. She wasn't shouting, but every word was deliberate. She knew the microphones were catching her in crisp detail, the way good live audio does when the speaker owns the room. Brian leaned forward. Congresswoman, are you saying you believe the president's approach to this debate has been counterproductive? She turned slightly toward him, but kept Trump in her peripheral vision. I'm saying the American people deserve better than counterproductive. They deserve leaders who can take a hard question without making it personal. And if I can take one tonight, so can he. The cheers. Now we're almost constant pockets of the audience, standing and clapping. A CNN camera panned across the faces, young, old, left. Leaning, right, leaning, but united in the moment. Trump pressed his lips together, then reached for his water bottle. It was a small gesture, but it told the story he needed a beat, and Crockett used that beat to turn the knife. I've been married for 12 years, Mr. President, and in those 12 years, I've learned that respect isn't about agreeing on everything. It's about knowing when not to cross certain lines. Maybe that's something Washington could learn from the rest of America. That one drew a mix of applause and knowing laughter. Brian finally had to step in his tone. Careful, all right. Let's move to the next question. But Crockett's point had been made. She had taken his insult, reframed it, and used it to underline exactly what she stood for. But she wasn't finished now. She was ready to take the fight from personal defense to a direct critique of his entire presidency. The applause still lingered as Brian Talbot shuffled his notes clearly, trying to regain control of the pace. But Crockett wasn't just waiting for the next prompt. She was already pivoting. She defended herself. Now she was going to use that very defense as the launch pad to go after Trump's record in a way that felt both pointed and grounded. She leaned slightly toward her mic, her tone conversational but precise. You know, Mr. President, since you brought my personal life into a national debate, let's talk about something personal for the American people. The way your administration's choices have reached into their homes, their paychecks, and their families' futures. The room quieted. Even the people who had been shuffling in their seats moments ago now looked up. Trump tilted his head, his arms crossing loosely in front of him. Here we go, he muttered into the mic. The words just loud enough for the audience to hear. Crockett didn't look away. You've talked a lot tonight about record jobs and the best economy, but let's talk specifics. Wages in rural counties, like Knox County, Missouri, haven't kept up with inflation. Small-town grocery stores are closing because corporate chains have pushed them out. Family farms are folding after generations because subsidies don't reach the people who actually work the land. They go to big corporations with lobbyists in Washington. There were murmurs from the audience, some in agreement, others bristling, but it didn't matter. She was driving her point forward. Trump's mouth opened slightly, but she pressed on. You've said America's winning, but for the woman in Clay County, Arkansas, who's deciding whether to fill her gas tank or buy her child's asthma medication. It doesn't feel like winning for the veterans in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, still waiting months for basic care at the VA. It doesn't feel like winning. A few people started clapping and then more joined in. Trump gestured toward the crowd. We've done more for veterans than any administration in history. Everybody knows that. Crockett turned her head slightly toward him. Her voice even then, why do they keep telling me they're being left behind? Are they all wrong, Mr. President? He hesitated just long enough for her to keep going. And let's talk about women, since you brought women's lives into the spotlight tonight. You've attacked them on Twitter. You've interrupted them in meetings. You've questioned their intelligence on national TV. And here's the truth. It's not just about me. It's about the message that sends to every young girl watching this. It says that when she works hard, when she's prepared, when she stands her ground, there will always be someone ready to tear her down with something that has nothing to do with her work. The crowd responded with a long wave of applause. Some standing again. The sound bounced off the high ceilings, mixing with the low hum of cameras whirring to capture every angle. Trump leaned into his mic. You've got a lot of opinions and facts, she cut in, without raising her voice. That drew a laugh from a cluster of audience members. She took a slow step closer to her podium, grounding herself. I've been in enough courtrooms to know when someone is trying to change the subject because they don't have a good answer. And Mr. President, when you turn a policy discussion into a personal attack, that's exactly what you're doing, dodging the real issues. But I'm not here to dodge anything. I'm here to talk about the people who sent me to Washington, and they're not asking me to protect their pride. They're asking me to protect their paychecks, their health, and their future. Brian glanced toward Trump, perhaps expecting him to jump in, but he didn't. The momentary stillness on his end gave Crockett the runway to finish the pivot. She scanned the crowd again, making eye contact with a few scattered faces. If you're watching this at home tonight, I want you to know you deserve leaders who answer the hard questions without throwing cheap shots. You deserve a government that doesn't treat politics like a reality show. And you deserve a president who can focus on your needs without making it about theirs. That final line pulled in another round of applause. This one louder than before. Trump uncrossed his arms and reached for his microphone, leaning toward it as if ready to reclaim the moment. You can talk a lot, Congresswoman, but talking doesn't fix anything. She met his gaze, neither does insulting the people trying. To the crowd's reaction was quick, a mix of cheers and whistles. Brian stepped in quickly, eager to get to the next prepared question. All right, we're moving now to audience questions, but the dynamic had changed completely. She wasn't just holding her ground anymore, she was steering the conversation, and the crowd was following her lead. The moderator's voice was still introducing the first audience question when the shift in the room became impossible to ignore. It wasn't just applause anymore. It was a kind of sustained energy that stayed with Crockett between answers, like the crowd had decided she'd earned their ear. A man in the fifth row, wearing a worn leather jacket, stood up with the mic. Mr. President, he began, I voted for you in 2016 and 2. Honorary 20, but I gotta say, I didn't come here to hear you talk about this Congresswoman's marriage. I came to hear about what you're gonna do for people like me who can't afford their prescriptions. That single statement drew scattered applause and even a whistle from the back. Crockett didn't move or smile. She let it hang there for Trump to answer. Trump gave the man a polite nod, though the tightness in his jaw was visible. Even from the stage, we've lowered prescription costs. The man shook his head. Not for me, you haven't. It was subtle, but the audience's mood tipped further toward Crockett. In that moment, Brian Talbot moved on to a woman from Flagstaff, Arizona. She addressed Crockett directly. Congresswoman, what would you do differently to make sure rural hospitals stay open? Crockett leaned toward her mic first. We stopped treating healthcare like a luxury we invest in, keeping small-town hospitals funded the same way we invest in highways. Because people's lives depend on it, we cut the loopholes that let big insurance companies rake in profits while refusing to cover basic care, and we make sure no one has to choose between keeping their home and paying for cancer treatment. The woman nodded, visibly moved the crowd, clapped again, and this time more of the applause came from sections that had been quiet earlier in the night. Trump leaned in, looking to reclaim the ground. Well, we've already done incredible things for healthcare. People don't give us credit. But he didn't get to finish. The next audience member, a young veteran from Pahrump, Nevada, spoke up before Brian could stop him. With all due respect, Mr. President, if you've done all these incredible things, why am I still waiting 9 months for an appointment at the VA? The room reacted, some murmurs, some cheers. Crockett stayed still, her eyes on the veteran as if to say, I hear you. Trump gave a measured nod. We'll look into that. Crockett took her opening. Or Mr. President, we could admit the system is broken and actually fix it instead of promising to look into it for another 4 years. That drew a quick burst of applause and a few shouts of yes from the crowd. It wasn't that Trump had lost the room entirely. His supporters were still there, still vocal, but the mood had fractured. More people were responding to Crockett, more were willing to challenge him directly from the corner of the stage. A camera operator adjusted his focus to get a tighter shot on her face. The control room knew what it had: a challenger holding her ground against the president, with the crowd visibly tilting in her direction. Brian, sensing the energy, asked Crocker another question on economic policy. She used it to paint a picture: the small hardware store in Ottumwa, Iowa, closing after 60 years because they couldn't compete with corporate chains. The dairy farmer in Madison County, Georgia, selling off his herd because feed prices skyrocketed. These aren't headlines, she said. These are people's lives, and they're tired of leaders talking at them instead of listening to them. The crowd erupted again, louder. Now Trump glanced toward Brian almost impatiently, like he wanted the conversation steered back in his favor, but the moderator wasn't cutting her off. She turned slightly toward Trump. You can say the economy's great, but until the people living paycheck to paycheck feel it in their pockets, it's just words. That line hit hard. People stood. They clapped, some stayed on their feet even after the noise started to fade. Trump tried to interject, nobody's done more. Crockett didn't even look at him. She focused on the crowd, letting them be the last word in that moment. Brian finally stepped in. We'll have time for one last question from the audience before we move into closing statements, but everyone in the room could feel it. This wasn't just a debate anymore, it was a turning tide, and Crockett was riding it straight toward the finish. The final audience question went to a middle-aged nurse from Prescott Valley, Arizona. She stood holding the mic in both hands and addressed Crockett directly. "Congresswoman, I've worked in healthcare for 22 years. I've seen ERs so full, we have patients in hallways, and I've had to tell people they can't get the medicine they need because their insurance won't cover it. What would you do to make sure nurses like me can actually help our patients?" Crockett didn't rush her answer. She took a moment, nodded toward the nurse, and let her voice soften just enough to signal respect. "First, thank you for what you do. I've been in enough hospitals to know the weight nurses carry, and you shouldn't have to do it with your hands tied behind your back." She stepped slightly closer to the edge of the stage, closing the physical gap between her and the audience. "Here's my promise. We fully fund rural and community hospitals so they can keep their doors open. We cap the cost of life-saving drugs. Period. We make insurance companies accountable for every denial they give with fines big enough to make them think twice before putting profit over people." The crowd clapped, the sound building quickly. Trump leaned toward his mic. "We've done more for healthcare workers than any administration in history." Everybody knows that Crockett turned toward him, keeping her voice steady if they knew it. "Mr. President, they wouldn't still be standing here asking for help." The applause came again, this time sharper, as if the crowd was starting to anticipate her ability to cut through his claims. Brian Talbot glanced at the clock on the moderator's table. "All right, it's time for closing statements. We'll start with Representative Crockett." Trump's eyebrows rose slightly, starting with her. Meant she'd get the last word of the night after his statement. Crockett stepped up to the mic, placing both hands lightly on the podium. "Tonight you heard a lot about numbers, about record jobs, about the best economy. But here's the thing, numbers don't tell the whole story, people do. And the stories I hear are from parents choosing between paying rent and buying groceries, from veterans still waiting for care, from nurses, like the one we just heard from, who are doing the work of 3 people because the system keeps cutting corners." She paused, letting the room breathe. "We can do better, and doing better starts with leadership that listens, respects, and answers the hard questions, without trying to distract you with personal insults." Trump shifted at his podium, clearly waiting for his turn to respond. Crockett continued, her voice firm but warm. "When you attacked my marriage tonight, you didn't just attack me, you attacked every woman who has ever been told she's only as valuable as the man standing next to her. And I will not stand for that. Not here, not in Washington, not anywhere." The crowd erupted, cheers, clapping, even a few shouts of, "That's right," from the back. She leaned forward slightly, speaking into the energy. "America doesn't need a president who measures people by their personal lives. We need one who measures themselves by the lives they've improved." The applause swelled again, filling the hall. Brian motioned to Trump for his closing statement. Trump spoke for several minutes, hitting familiar talking points about economic success, military strength, and promises for the future. He didn't return to the marriage comment, and that absence was telling. When he finished, Brian thanked both participants and began to wrap up. But Crockett wasn't done. She stepped back to her mic for one last thought, breaking the usual format. "One more thing," she said, her tone softer but no less sharp, to every young person watching tonight. Especially young women, don't let anyone define your worth by something they can use against you. Define it yourself and then stand in it. Even when they try to knock you down, the room stood not just parts of it, but most of it. People clapping, some cheering, the sound echoing as the cameras kept rolling. Trump offered a tight smile, but the image that would run on every news broadcast the next morning was clear: Jasmine Crockett standing tall at the podium, the crowd behind her. But the real test of what she'd done tonight wouldn't be measured in applause. It would be in the firestorm that was about to hit once those 47 seconds went viral, by the time the stage lights dimmed and the moderator thanked the audience. The night's most defining moment was already leaving the room in pieces, carried in phone notifications, social media posts, and text messages pinging from pocket to pocket. Backstage, Crockett's team moved quickly. Her communications director, Lorna Whitfield, had one earbud in, listening to a producer from MSNBC. "They're already running the clip," she whispered, barely able to hide the grin on her face. "It's everywhere." Crockett sipped from a paper cup of water, not letting herself smile too much. She knew how fast the political news cycle could turn, but this wasn't just a headline. This was the kind of moment that stuck her phone. Buzzed 3 missed calls from colleagues on the Hill, a dozen unread texts, and an alert from Twitter. Jasmine Crockett is trending. She opened the app, briefly saw the clip of her saying, "Neither does insulting the people trying to," playing on repeat with captions, and closed it before she could get pulled into the scroll. Out in the press area, reporters huddled near the rope line, tossing questions at anyone who would stop to talk. One of Trump's aides brushed past without comment. A political analyst from a major network stood in front of a camera saying, "What we saw tonight was one of the most effective real-time rebuttals we've had in a presidential setting. In years, she didn't just defend herself, she flipped the power dynamic on him." Meanwhile, Trump was holding his own post-event gathering in a side room. The tone was markedly different. He repeated his talking points from the stage, but the reporters kept circling back to the marriage remark. "Do you regret it?" One asked. "Why bring it up?" Another pressed. He waved them off, calling it lighthearted, but the footage rolling on nearby TV screens told a different story. One of a moment slipping out of his control across the country in living rooms and on bar TVs. The exchange played again and again in a diner in Reno, Nevada. Two older women leaned over their coffee cups. "I don't even agree with half her policies," one said, but she put him in his place without screaming or losing her cool. That takes skill. In a small apartment in Fresno, a young law student named Damon Alvarez was watching with his roommate. "That's how you handle a cheap shot," he said. "You stay calm, you stay sharp, and you make it about the bigger picture." Even some conservative commentators, while critical of her politics, conceded she'd handled the moment well. One panelist on a late-night cable segment admitted, "Look, I support the president, but he walked into that one. She was ready by midnight." The clip had been viewed over 4 million times across platforms, hashtags like no. 47 seconds and Crockett clapback were trending alongside video edits that slowed down her delivery. For dramatic effect, her communications director was fielding interview requests from every major outlet. "Good morning, America, CNN. The View, everyone wants you tomorrow," Lorna said, scrolling through her phone as they walked to the black SUV, waiting to take them back to the hotel. In the quiet of the ride, Crockett finally let herself exhale. She wasn't naive. She knew Trump's base would defend him, that the moment would be spun in a dozen different ways by the morning. But she also knew something rare had happened tonight, a moment that couldn't be dismissed as a fluke. Her husband Marcus had texted only 2 words, "Proud of you." She didn't need more than that. By the time she reached the hotel, late-night talk shows were already making it part of their opening monologues on one. The host joked, 47 seconds, that's all it took. "I've seen microwave dinners take longer to cook," the audience roared, but behind the laughter was recognition. She had turned the tables and fast the next morning. Editorial headlines reflected the split reactions. Crockett seizes moment in televised showdown. Trump stumbles, opponent gains ground. Was it fair game or below the belt? Cable news panels ran split-screen footage. Trump speaking on one side, Crocker's calm but pointed rebuttal on the other. Commentators dissected her timing, her choice of words, even the way she held her gaze through it all. Crockett stayed on message in her interviews. "This wasn't about me, it was about the American people and what they deserve from their leaders." But as the dust settled, she knew the real work was just beginning. Because moments like this don't just boost your profile, they put a target on your back. It was nearly 1:00 a.m. when Jasmine Crockett finally stepped into her hotel room in downtown Phoenix. The city outside was quiet, the lights from nearby office towers flickering against the window. She kicked off her heels, set her phone on the desk, and just stood there for a moment, letting the stillness soak in. The television in the corner was on mute, but she didn't need the sound to know what was playing. Every channel was looping the same footage. Trump's remark, her steady stare, the rebuttal, the crowd's reaction. Her communications director had called it the clip, like it had already become its own entity, something separate from the rest of the night. She walked over, grabbed the remote, and turned the sound back on. It was one of the morning news promos airing early for the East Coast coming up. How Representative Jasmine Crockett turned a personal attack into a defining political moment. She shut it off again, exhaling. Her husband called, just as she sat on the edge of the bed. "I watched it live," he said. His voice was warm, steady, the way it always was when she'd just gone through something intense. "You didn't let him get to you." "I couldn't," she replied. "Not with the whole country watching. If I'd made it about me, I'd have lost the point. You made it about all of them." Instead, he said, "That's why it worked." After they hung up, she poured herself a glass of water and sat at the small table by the window, looking down at the empty street. She thought about the people she'd mentioned on stage: the coal miner in West Virginia, the nurse from Arizona, the veteran from Pennsylvania. She thought about the young women who might have been watching, hearing her say that no one else gets to define their worth. She also thought about the cost. A moment like this could energize supporters, yes, but it could also invite attacks some far uglier than what she'd faced tonight. The political world wasn't known for letting things fade quietly. But then she remembered the look on the audience's faces, not just her supporters, but the ones who had walked in skeptical, maybe even hostile, and had left leaning forward when she spoke. That was the point, not winning every vote, but breaking through the noise long enough for people to actually hear you. She pulled a small notebook from her bag, one she carried for thoughts she didn't want to lose, and wrote a few lines: stay steady, hit back when it matters, always turn it back to them, somewhere across town. Trump was probably telling his aides that he'd gotten the better of her, but the footage told a different story, the way she'd let his words hang before responding, the way she'd shifted the frame from her personal life to his public record, the way the crowd had started turning one question at a time. That was the lesson she wanted people to take away, that in politics, as in life, you don't always get to choose the moment, but you do get to choose the response. And sometimes, if you choose carefully, you can take a blow meant to knock you down and use it to stand taller than before. She set down the pen and glanced once more at her phone. Messages were still coming in: colleagues, friends, strangers. One from a high school student in Topeka read, "I've never seen someone handle a guy like that on live TV. Made me feel like maybe I could do it too someday." That one stayed with her the longest. By the time she finally crawled into bed, the adrenaline was wearing off, but the clarity remained. Moments pass, headlines fade, but the example you set, the way you carry yourself when the spotlight turns harsh, that sticks. The next morning, she'd wake up to another round of interviews, think pieces, and social media storms. Some would praise her, others would tear her down. That was politics. But tonight, as she closed her eyes, she knew she'd done more than win a moment. She'd reminded people that respect and leadership isn't about who can shout the loudest, but who can stand their ground with purpose. And to anyone watching, whether in a packed convention hall or on a phone in a small-town kitchen, her message was simple: don't let someone else write your story for you. So if you're watching this and you take anything from what happened on that stage, let it be this: strength isn't about never being attacked. It's about knowing who you are and making sure everyone else knows it too. If that resonates with you, share this story, subscribe, and keep the conversation going. Because the more we talk about what real leadership looks like, the closer we get to demanding it from everyone who claims to lead.